There is a story that Bola Ahmed Tinubu tells about himself. The story goes like this. In 1993, when the most democratic election in Nigerian history was annulled by a military dictator, Tinubu stood up. He resisted. He risked his freedom. He went into exile. He fought for Moshood Abiola's mandate. He was a democracy hero, a man who chose principle over safety when the Nigerian state was at its most brutal. That story has been told so many times, in so many Lagos banquets, in so many presidential campaign biographies, in so many political eulogies, that it has acquired the texture of established fact. AFRONEWSHQ is going to examine that story today. Not to destroy it, not to defend it, to do what this channel exists to do: place the documented historical record alongside the political mythology and show you precisely where they match and precisely where they do not. Because the gap between what Tinubu actually did during the June 12th crisis and what his political mythology claims he did is not a minor biographical footnote. It is the foundation on which Nigeria's current president has built every claim to democratic legitimacy. And a foundation that has not been critically examined is not a foundation. It is a campaign poster. What did Tinubu actually do when Abiola's mandate was stolen? The answer is more complicated, more textured, and more politically revealing than either his defenders or his critics have been willing to say out loud. The June 12 crisis did not produce one kind of Nigerian. It produced at least three. There were those who fought, there were those who fled, and there were those who found a way to do both and to call the fleeing a form of fighting. Understanding which category Tinubu belongs to is the work of this video. Most channels will either defend him or attack him. We are going to do neither. We are going to follow the documented record, name the gaps, and let you reach your own conclusion with the full information in front of you. If you've never been here before, you just found Nigeria's most analytical political channel. Subscribe, because this analysis has never been done at this level of precision anywhere in Nigerian political commentary. Nigeria in 1993, the political architecture of the transition program. To understand what Tinubu did or did not do during the June 12 crisis, you must first understand the political environment in which he was operating, because the environment was not simply a democracy versus dictatorship binary. It was a complex, layered political terrain in which virtually every major actor was simultaneously playing multiple roles, some principled, some opportunistic, most a mixture of both. Ibrahim Babangida's transition to civilian rule program had been running since 1986. It was, by any objective assessment, the most elaborate and most deliberately sabotaged transition program in African democratic history. Babangida created two political parties, the Social Democratic Party and the National Republican Convention, by government fiat. He determined their ideologies, their funding structures, their candidate pools. He banned previous politicians, unbanned them, rebanned them. He moved the election date multiple times, 5 times between 1990 and 1993 alone, each postponement designed to extend the military's hold on federal resources while maintaining the international legitimacy that the transition program provided.
Bola Ahmed Tinubu was a product of this transition program. In 1992, he was elected to the Senate of the Federal Republic of Nigeria under the Social Democratic Party, Abiola's party, representing Lagos West Senatorial District. His election to the Senate was not an act of rebellion against the military system. It was participation in a political process that the military had designed, funded, and controlled. Every senator elected in 1992, including Tinubu, owed their political existence to a framework that Babangida had constructed and could dismantle at will. This is the first piece of context that Tinubu's democratic mythology consistently omits. He was not a dissident who entered politics from outside the military-managed system. He was a beneficiary of the military-managed transition who became a dissident to varying degrees and at varying times when the system turned against the candidate he was aligned with. June 12, 1993. what the election was, and what its annulment meant. On June 12, 1993, Nigeria conducted what has since been called the freest and fairest election in its history. The presidential contest was between Moshood Kashimawo Olawale Abiola of the Social Democratic Party and Bashir Tofa of the National Republican Convention. The results that were officially released before the annulment and the results that independent observers, civil society organizations, and the international community had tabulated showed Abiola winning with a commanding majority across multiple geopolitical zones, including victories in states that no southern candidate had previously won. The significance of June 12 was not simply that Abiola won, it was that he won in a way that demonstrated the possibility of a genuinely trans-ethnic Nigerian political identity, a Yoruba Muslim businessman who had carried the North, who had won states where his ethnic identity should have been a liability, who had demonstrated that Nigerian voters, given a genuine choice, could choose beyond ethnic and religious calculation. That demonstration was, for the Nigerian military and its embedded interests, far more threatening than any individual candidate's victory. On June 23, 1993, 11 days after the election, Babangida annulled the result. The legal instrument was an interim national government decree that was itself a constitutional fiction. The stated justification was a court injunction obtained by a Tofa-aligned group that had challenged the election's conduct before the results were fully collated. The actual reason, as subsequent historical analysis has established, was the military's calculation, reinforced by specific northern political and military figures whose identity has never been definitively established in a formal setting, that an Abiola presidency would restructure the political economy of federal power in ways that their interests could not accommodate. Tinubu's position at the moment of the annulment, the documented facts. At the moment of June 12 annulment, Tinubu was a sitting senator. He had a constitutional mandate, an institutional position, a public platform, and a personal political investment in the SDP system that Abiola's victory would have consolidated. He was not a private citizen watching events unfold from the sidelines. He was a serving federal legislator with both the institutional standing and the personal political incentive to respond to the annulment publicly and consequentially. What he did immediately after June 23, 1993 is the beginning of the documentary record that this video will build precisely.
The specific political actions Tinubu took and did not take in the 18 months between the June 12 annulment and his departure into exile will be mapped document by document in Section 3. The gap between the mythology's timeline and the actual timeline is where the analysis gets most revealing. The most politically sensitive question about Tinubu's June 12 record is not whether he resisted, it is what his business and financial relationships with the Abacha government looked like while his political persona was in exile resisting that same government. That question will be addressed in Section 5 with the documented record. Phase 1. The Senate Walkout, July 1993. The first documented act of resistance in Tinubu's June 12 record is the Senate Walkout. In July 1993, in response to the annulment and the imposition of the Ernest Shonikan-led interim Nigerian government, a group of senators, including Tinubu, walked out of the Senate chamber in protest. The walkout was a visible, public, institutional act of defiance. It was covered by the Nigerian press. It was politically costly in the immediate term. It meant forfeiting the institutional privileges and protections of a Senate seat at a moment when the military government was demonstrating its willingness to detain, harass, and suppress political opposition. The Senate walkout is the most straightforwardly documented act of resistance in Tinubu's June 12 record. It is real, it is in the historical record, it is not mythology. What the mythology does is elevate this one documented act into the centerpiece of a broader resistance narrative that does not have the same evidentiary density. Phase 2, NADECO, 1994, and the formation of the opposition coalition. In May 1994, the National Democratic Coalition, NADECO, was formed. NADECO was an umbrella body of pro-democracy activists, politicians, lawyers, journalists, and civil society organizations committed to the revalidation of Abiola's June 12 mandate. Its founding membership included some of the most consequential democratic activists in Nigerian history: Gani Fawehimi, Anthony Enahoro, Abraham Adesanya, Ayo Opadoku, and others whose commitment to the June 12 cause was documented, sustained, and in many cases personally costly to the point of imprisonment, torture, and in some cases death. Tinubu's NADECO engagement preceded his departure into exile. Once in exile, his resistance took the form of advocacy from outside Nigeria, a form of opposition that carries moral weight but carries different risk than the resistance of those who stayed inside the country and continued to agitate from within the Abacha government's direct reach.
Phase 3. Exile, 1994 to 1998. By late 1994, Tinubu had left Nigeria. The security environment under Sani Abacha, who had seized power in November 1993, had become genuinely lethal for identifiable pro-democracy activists. Abacha's security apparatus arrested, detained, and in documented cases, tortured and killed political opponents. Journalists were imprisoned. NADECO activists were hunted. Abiola himself was arrested in June 1994 after declaring himself president and died in detention in July 1998, a death whose circumstances have never been fully resolved. Tinubu's exile was not unique among NADECO-aligned figures. Multiple significant democratic activists went into exile in this period. Wole Soyinka, who was perhaps the most internationally prominent, also left Nigeria and conducted his resistance from outside. Exile was a rational response to a genuinely dangerous environment, and it should not be characterized as cowardice without acknowledging that people who stayed and were imprisoned or killed were making a choice whose costs were among the highest available to a Nigerian citizen in that period. But the mythology around Tinubu's exile is where the documented record begins to require the most careful navigation. The mythology presents the exile as a period of uninterrupted, focused, politically committed resistance, a man in the wilderness fighting for democracy from a foreign base at great personal cost. The documented record of this period is more complex. What the exile period actually looked like. Tinubu spent portions of his exile years in the United Kingdom and the United States. During this period, he was involved in advocacy activities connected to the June 12 cause, meetings with international officials, connections with diaspora pro-democracy networks, engagements with international human rights organizations that were monitoring the Abacha government's human rights record. He was also, during this period, not a man without resources. Tinubu had been involved in business activities, including his connections to Mobil Oil Nigeria and financial interests in Lagos that had produced a level of personal wealth that made his exile significantly more comfortable than the exile of NADECO activists who left Nigeria without financial cushion. This is not a moral failing, but it is a material fact that is relevant to understanding the specific character of his resistance. A well-resourced exile engaging in advocacy from a position of relative safety is a different kind of political actor from a resistance fighter enduring hardship and physical danger. The most important distinction in the Tinubu June 12 narrative is between those who resisted Abacha while remaining in Nigeria and those who resisted from exile. Both forms of resistance were real, but they were not equivalent in risk or in sacrifice. Gani Fawehimi was arrested multiple times by the Abacha government, subjected to prolonged detention without trial, denied medical treatment while in custody, and continued to file legal challenges against the military government from within Nigerian soil until the moment of Abacha's death. He never left, he never stopped. His resistance was daily, physical, present, and personally costly in ways that no amount of exile advocacy replicates. When Tinubu's political mythology positions him in the same category of June 12 heroism as Fawehimi, Abraham Adesanya, or the journalists and activists who were imprisoned and tortured while Tinubu was abroad, it is performing a category collapse
that the historical record does not support. Exile resistance and in-country resistance are both legitimate responses to state violence, but they are not the same thing, and calling them the same thing does a specific disservice to those whose sacrifices were categorically greater.
Phase 3 Assessment. Tinubu's exile is documented. His NADECO association is documented. His Senate walkout is documented. The mythologies claim that he was a primary and central figure in the June 12 resistance rather than a significant but secondary participant who occupied a safer position than those who led the resistance from inside Nigeria is where the documented record most clearly diverges from the political narrative. The specific claims of the Tinubu democracy mythology examined one by one. Let us go through the specific claims of the Tinubu democratic mythology not as a character attack, but as a documentary accountability exercise, because a man who has governed Lagos for 8 years and now governs Nigeria cannot ask to be exempted from the same historical scrutiny that he would apply to his opponents. Claim 1. Tinubu was one of the primary leaders of the June 12 resistance. The historical record does not support the word primary. Primary leaders of the June 12 resistance are identifiable by specific criteria. They organized the resistance from within Nigeria. They bore the direct personal cost of imprisonment or physical threat while doing so, and their activities were the operational foundation on which the resistance coalition functioned. By those criteria, the primary leaders of the June 12 resistance were figures like Gani Fawehimi, Abraham Adesonya, Beko Ransom Kuti, Anthony Enahul, and Ayo Opadokun, people who were physically present, repeatedly arrested, and operationally central to NADECO's activities inside Nigeria. Tinubu was a significant associated figure, a senator who walked out, a NADECO member who went into exile, a person who maintained connections to the resistance network from abroad. Significant associated figure and primary leader are different historical categories. The mythology consistently promotes him from the second to the first without the documentary evidence to justify the promotion. Claim 2. Tinubu risked everything for the June 12 cause. This claim requires the most careful examination because it contains a genuine truth embedded in a significant exaggeration. The genuine truth: Tinubu was on the Abacha government's list of wanted NADECO activists. His assets in Nigeria, including properties, were reportedly under threat of seizure during his exile. He could not return to Nigeria without risking arrest. The political consequences of his June 12 alignment were real and not trivial. He did put himself in an adverse relationship with the most brutal military government Nigeria has produced. The significant exaggeration. Risking everything implies a level of personal sacrifice that the documented record does not fully support. Tinubu was in exile in London and the United States, cities where Nigerian political exiles of means could live with comfort, access international networks, and conduct advocacy from a position of relative safety. His children were educated. His business interests, as documented in the following section, were not entirely severed from Nigerian economic life during his exile. The people who risked everything for June 12 are the ones in Nigerian prisons during this period, the ones who were tortured, who died in custody, who watched their families destroyed by the Abacha apparatus. Tinubu's risk was real. It was not everything. Claim 3. Tinubu's return marked the victory of democracy over military rule. This is the most dramatically mythologized claim in the Tinubu democratic narrative, and it is also the most easily interrogated by the historical timeline.
Tinubu returned to Nigeria in 1998, not because the pro-democracy struggle had defeated the Abacha government, but because Abacha died on June 8, 1998, under circumstances that have never been fully clarified, while Abiola, the man whose mandate the entire struggle was supposed to restore, died in custody on July 7, 1998, 33 days after Abacha, during a meeting with U.S. State Department officials,
also under circumstances that have never been fully resolved. The June 12 struggle did not achieve its stated objective. Abiola never became president. His mandate was never formally revalidated in the sense that the resistance demanded the swearing in of the legitimate winner of the June 12 election. What happened instead was that the military's internal calculations, not the NADECO resistance, produced a transition to civilian rule under General Abdulsalami Abubakar that ultimately led to the 1999 elections and Olusegun Obasanjo's presidency. Tinubu returned to a Nigeria in which the cause he had associated himself with had not triumphed in the terms the resistance itself had defined triumph. He returned because the danger had passed, not because the victory had been won. He then won the Lagos governorship in 1999, an outcome that was made possible not by the June 12 victory, but by the military's managed transition that replaced one general's illegitimate government with another general's democratically legitimized presidency. The deepest irony in the Tinubu June 12 mythology is that the man who has most consistently and materially benefited from June 12 as a political symbol is the man whose actual contribution to the June 12 struggle was most moderate among those who claim its legacy, Gani Fawehinmi, who arguably sacrificed more for June 12 than any other Nigerian, never became governor, never became president. He died in 2009, a lawyer and activist to the end, without converting his democratic sacrifice into political office. The people who bore the most cost of the June 12 struggle, the imprisoned, the tortured, the killed, their families, received no political dividend from its symbolic power. The person who has extracted the greatest political dividend from the June 12 symbol, using it as the foundation of his democratic credentials, invoking it in every election cycle, positioning himself as its primary inheritor, is the man who spent the crisis's most dangerous years in comfortable exile in London and Washington. That is not an accusation. It is a structural observation about how political mythology works in Nigeria. The people who write the history of a struggle are rarely the same people who paid its full price. Now, before we get to the most sensitive part of this analysis, the documented questions about Tinubu's business relationships during the period he was supposedly in exile, resisting the Abacha government, drop a comment. Tell me, do you think it is possible to be simultaneously in exile, resisting a military government, and maintaining business connections to that same government economic apparatus? Because the historical record suggests that is precisely the question we need to examine. I want your take before I give you the documented answer. The drug forfeiture case, the document that exists. AFRONEWSHQ is going to address the most documented and most consistently avoided piece of the Tinubu biographical record from this period. And we are going to do so with precision, not with allegation. In 1993, the United States government filed a civil asset forfeiture action in the Northern District of Illinois. The action concerned funds in accounts held at Intercontinental Bank in Lagos. The U.S. government's complaint alleged that these funds, amounting to approximately $460,000 US, were traceable to proceeds from a drug trafficking network. Tinubu settled the forfeiture action in 1993 by consenting to the forfeiture of the funds without admitting guilt. A civil forfeiture settlement in the United States legal system does not require an admission of wrongdoing, and Tinubu has consistently maintained that the settlement was made to avoid protracted litigation and not as an admission of involvement in drug trafficking. The settlement is a documented legal fact. The funds were forfeited. The case is in the public legal record. What remains contested is the interpretation of what the settlement means about Tinubu's knowledge of the funds' origins. These are contested questions that AFRONEWSHQ will not resolve. The U.S. legal system's civil forfeiture mechanism does not establish the factual questions that only a criminal conviction or a full evidentiary trial would establish. What this channel will say is this: a man whose democratic mythology centers on his principled resistance to a government associated with drug trafficking networks and state violence, and who simultaneously has a documented civil asset forfeiture settlement
in the United States during the period of that resistance has a biographical complexity that the mythology consistently suppresses. The suppression of that complexity is itself politically significant. The business interests during exile, what the record shows. The broader question of Tinubu's business interests during his exiled years is more difficult to document with precision because Nigerian business records from the Abacha period are not consistently in the public domain. What is documented is the following. Tinubu had established business interests in Nigeria, particularly connected to the oil and gas sector through his mobile-related network and through Lagos-based commercial activities that predate his exile. The question of whether those interests were fully suspended, partially maintained through proxies, or actively managed in some form during his exile period is one that his biographers have not answered with documentary specificity. The Abacha government seized the assets of some identified NADECO activists. Wole Soyinka's assets were reportedly targeted, for example. The record of whether Tinubu's business interests experienced the same level of confiscatory treatment from the Abacha government or whether they were managed with less disruption than the military's treatment of other NADECO figures' assets is not publicly established with the documentary density that would allow a definitive conclusion. What can be said with documented certainty is this. Tinubu returned from exile in 1998 with sufficient financial resources to immediately and credibly contest the 1999 Lagos governorship election, a contest that required substantial funding, organizational infrastructure, and political network activation. The financial capacity he demonstrated in 1999 is consistent with a man whose economic base was not destroyed during the exile years, as it was for some of his NADECO contemporaries whose assets were more thoroughly targeted by the Abacha apparatus.
The honest assessment of the financial dimension of Tinubu's June 12 record is not that he was definitively collaborating with the Abacha government while publicly opposing it. The evidence does not establish that conclusion. The honest assessment is that Tinubu's financial position during and after the exile years is inconsistent with the image of a man who sacrificed material security for principle. A man who truly had his assets seized, his business interests destroyed, and his economic base dismantled by the Abacha government would not have emerged from exile in 1998 with the financial capacity to run a statewide gubernatorial campaign in Nigeria's most commercially significant state. The financial trajectory of his post-exile political career is more consistent with a man whose economic interests were substantially preserved during the exile years than with a man who paid the full financial price of resistance. The June 12 mythology performs a specific political function in the Tinubu narrative that has nothing to do with historical accuracy. It performs the function of democratic legitimation for a political career that has been, in its operational reality, predominantly about machine politics, financial power, and institutional control. Every criticism of Tinubu's governance, the LASG financial opacity, the Godfather allegations, the money laundering questions, the democratic backsliding concerns, is deflected by the June 12 mythology. The response is always, this man risked his life for democracy. How dare you question his democratic credentials? The June 12 mythology is therefore not simply a historical narrative. It is a political shield, a preemptive inoculation against accountability. Interrogating the mythology is not an attack on June 12 or on Abiola's memory. It is the most fundamental act of democratic accountability available to Nigerian citizens, requiring their president to be measured against the same documentary standard that he would apply to anyone else. Why the June 12 question is not only a historical one. The reason this historical examination matters is not academic. It matters because the June 12 mythology is an active political instrument in the present, not a settled historical narrative about the past. Tinubu invoked June 12 throughout his 2023 presidential campaign,
He invoked it in his inauguration. He invokes it in responses to criticism of his governance. His political allies invoke it whenever questions about his fitness, his transparency, or his democratic commitments are raised. The mythology's political life is ongoing and consequential, and it produces a specific and damaging political effect. It positions any criticism of Tinubu's governance as an attack on June 12, as an insult to Abiola's memory, as a betrayal of the democratic struggle. It makes Tinubu personally coterminous with June 12 in a way that insulates him from the accountability that democratic governance requires. A president who cannot be criticized without his defenders invoking his democratic mythology is a president operating in a hagiographic bubble, and hagiographic bubbles are precisely the political environment in which the worst governance decisions flourish, because the accountability mechanisms that would normally check those decisions are preemptively delegitimized by the mythology.
The June 12 generation that did not become president. Perhaps the most important political observation in this entire analysis is this: the Nigerians who sacrificed most for June 12 are not in Asarok. Gani Fawehimi died in 2009, having spent his career being arrested, detained, and harassed for his consistent, principled in-country resistance to every form of Nigerian political authoritarianism, military and civilian alike. He never converted his sacrifice into elected office. He explicitly refused the political route that would have required the kind of compromises his conscience would not allow. Moshood Abiola died in custody in 1998, having spent 4 years imprisoned for the simple act of claiming the presidency that the Nigerian people had given him. His family was targeted. His wife, Kudirat, was assassinated in 1996, shot dead in her car in Lagos by agents whose relationship to the Abacha government has been documented, though never fully prosecuted. Abiola never saw the democracy his election was supposed to inaugurate. Beko Ransom Kuti, physician, activist, NADECO figure, spent years in Abacha's prisons for his resistance activities. He returned from prison with his health permanently damaged. He did not become a governor or a minister. The pattern is consistent. Those who sacrificed most for June 12 were not rewarded by the political system that emerged from its ashes. Those who extracted the greatest political benefit from the June 12 mythology are those whose sacrifices were most moderate and most strategically calculated. What accountability for June 12 actually requires? AFRONEWSHQ is not arguing that Tinubu had no role in the June 12 resistance. The documented record establishes that he had a real role: a Senate walkout, NADECO association, exile advocacy. That role deserves acknowledgement. What we are arguing is that the specific role he played deserves accurate historical categorization, not the inflated mythology that positions him as a primary hero of the resistance, but the measured historical assessment that places him as a significant secondary participant who bore real but not maximum costs, and who subsequently extracted maximum political benefit from the symbolic legacy of a struggle whose primary heroes were less politically rewarded. That accurate historical categorization is not an insult to June 12. It is an act of respect for the people who paid June 12's highest price, by refusing to allow their sacrifice to be appropriated for the political legitimation of someone whose contribution to that sacrifice was partial, strategic, and ultimately self-serving in ways that the mythology does not acknowledge. The mythology timeline versus the actual timeline. We said we would map the gap between the mythology's timeline and the actual timeline of Tinubu's engagement in June 12. The gap is this: the mythology presents a continuous, sustained, centrally organized resistance from 1993 through to 1998, in which Tinubu was a primary leader. The actual timeline shows a real but secondary role in the immediate post-annulment period, Senate walkout, early NADECO association, followed by departure into exile in 1994,
followed by advocacy from abroad that was real but categorically different from the in-country resistance that NADECO's most consequential figures maintained, followed by return to Nigeria in 1998, not after a democratic victory, but after the natural deaths of both Abacha and Abiola, followed by political harvesting of the June 12 symbol in the 1999 Lagos governorship election. The mythology compresses this trajectory into a heroic linear narrative. The actual trajectory is more ambiguous, more self-interested, and more politically calculated than the mythology acknowledges.
The business and financial questions. We said we would address the question of Tinubu's business relationships during the exile period. The documented answer is, the 1993 U.S. civil asset forfeiture settlement is a matter of legal record whose full implications cannot be determined without evidence that a civil forfeiture proceeding does not. The financial capacity he demonstrated on return from exile is inconsistent with the image of a man whose assets were destroyed by the Abacha apparatus. The specific nature of his business interests during the exile years is not documented with the precision that would allow definitive conclusions. What is documentable is the gap between the mythology's poverty of sacrifice narrative and the financial capacity that the historical record demonstrates he retained. The 5 historical questions that Nigerian democracy still requires answers to. First, was Tinubu formally on the Abacha government asset seizure list, and if so, which of his specific assets were seized and which were not? This is a documentable question. The answer has never been placed in the public record by Tinubu's political team, despite the mythology's claim that he lost everything during the exile years. Second, what was the specific nature of his advocacy activities during the exile years? Which international officials did he meet? Which documents did he produce or sign? Which pro-democracy platforms did he address? And what were the operational consequences of those activities for the NADECO coalition inside Nigeria? A primary resistance leader leaves an operational footprint. The detailed operational footprint of Tinubu's exile advocacy has not been placed in the public historical record. Third, what is the complete picture of the 1993 U.S. civil asset forfeiture settlement, including the specific affidavits, the complete government complaint, and the full settlement documentation? And what does that complete picture show about the circumstances of the forfeited funds' origins? This is a public legal record that has never been fully entered into Nigerian public political discourse. Fourth, what is the documented record of Tinubu's relationship with the Shonekon interim national government, which governed Nigeria between August and November 1993, and did he have any formal or informal engagement with that government that would complicate the clean resistance narrative the mythology presents for the entire 1993 to 1998 period? Fifth, what is the complete account of how Tinubu financed his 1999 Lagos gubernatorial campaign, the sources of the funding, the organizational infrastructure, and the political network activation that produced his victory? And how does that account square with the claim that his economic base was destroyed during the exile years? Campaign finance in Nigeria in 1999 was not transparent, but the magnitude of resources required for a competitive Lagos gubernatorial campaign in that period is not consistent with someone who had emerged from 5 years of asset seizure and economic devastation.
We began with the question, what did Tinubu actually do when Abiola's mandate was stolen? The documented record allows us to answer that question with the following precision. He did resist partially, at real but not maximum cost, as a secondary participant in a resistance whose primary leadership was borne by others. The Senate walkout was real. The NADECO association was real. The exile was real. The personal adversity of being on a Nigerian military government's wanted list was real. He did not do what the mythology claims.
He was not a primary leader of the June 12 resistance. He did not sacrifice everything. He did not fight continuously from within Nigeria at the level of risk that the resistance's true primary figures maintained, and he did not return to Nigeria because the democratic struggle achieved its stated goal of restoring Abiola's mandate. He returned because the danger passed. And what he did after returning, extracting maximum political benefit from the June 12 symbol, building the most powerful political machine in Nigerian state-level history on the foundation of Lagos governorship, and ultimately ascending to the presidency by leveraging the democratic mythology that his moderate contribution to the June 12 struggle had been inflated into a primary heroism that the historical record cannot support, represents the most sophisticated political operation in post-military Nigerian democratic history. The betrayal in the title of this video is not a simple one. It is not the betrayal of a man who secretly collaborated with Abacha while publicly opposing him. The documented record does not establish that. The betrayal is more subtle and more structurally damaging. It is the betrayal of historical truth by political mythology. It is what happens when the symbolic legacy of a genuine democratic struggle with real heroes who paid real prices is appropriated by a man whose contribution to that struggle was real but secondary, and whose political career has been built on the inflation of that contribution into a primary heroism that the historical record cannot support. The people who died for June 12 deserve better than to have their sacrifice permanently instrumentalized for the political legitimation of someone who was present at the edges of the resistance, not at its center. Abiola deserves better. Kudirat deserves better. Gani deserves better. Beko deserves better. And Nigerian democracy deserves a president whose democratic credentials can withstand the same historical scrutiny he would apply to anyone else. You now have the documented record, not the mythology, not the attack, the record. What you do with it is the work of democratic citizenship. Share it, challenge it, demand that the questions it raises are answered publicly and with documentation, because a democracy that cannot interrogate the historical claims of its leaders is not fully a democracy yet. AFRONEWSHQ, Nigeria deserves better analysis. See you in the next one.